Jason Iron Fist Carter had always been a fighter. Ever since he was young, his body had been a tool of discipline and strength. His father, a former boxer turned coach, had introduced him to martial arts before he could even walk properly. By the time he was a teenager, he was already dominating in competitions across the country. His movements were sharp and deliberate, honed through years of rigorous training. He had a reputation in the ring for his calm demeanor and brutal precision. People feared him, not just because of his physical strength, but because of the control he maintained over his emotions. He could read his opponent before they even moved, predicting every step, every strike. He was not just an athlete, he was a strategist. As a young adult, Jason's future seemed limitless. He signed with a respected martial arts promotion and quickly climbed through the ranks, earning the title of national champion at the peak of his career. He was a master of the striking arts, particularly kickboxing and Muay Thai. His body a living weapon, disciplined and deadly. His rise to the top seemed inevitable. Fans adored him, coaches envied him, and fellow fighters respected him. He was everything a fighter aspired to be, but that wasn't the full picture of Jason's life. Beneath the accolades, he had a dark side. His discipline didn't always extend beyond the ring. He lived a life of excess, late nights, flashy cars, expensive tastes. Success had its temptations, and Jason gave in. He was reckless with his relationships and his finances, throwing caution to the wind, but his most dangerous vice was his arrogance. Jason believed that nothing could touch him, that he was untouchable both in the ring and in life. But the world has a way of reminding you that no one is invincible. One evening, after a particularly successful title defense, Jason found himself celebrating at an upscale nightclub. Drinks flowed, music thumped, and the crowd cheered as he made his way through the velvet ropes into a private section. Everything seemed perfect, but when an argument broke out between Jason and a rival fighter over a woman, the situation escalated. Words were exchanged, fists were thrown. Jason, in a drunken rage, delivered a blow that broke his rival's jaw and knocked him unconscious. The bouncers quickly intervened, but not before the altercation spilled into the streets. The fight continued outside the club, where things got even more out of hand. Police arrived, and Jason was arrested for assault, battery, and attempted manslaughter. His championship belt, his reputation, his own life, everything came crashing down in a single night. The judicial system moved swiftly. Due to his prior record and the severity of the charges, Jason was sentenced to prison. He was stripped of his title, his career, and the life he had built. The hard, disciplined world he had known in the ring was now replaced by the chaos of a maximum security prison. The transition was brutal. There was no structure here, no referees, no applause after a successful move. In prison, the only thing that mattered was survival. And Jason quickly learned that his skills as a fighter meant little in a world where everyone was armed with something more dangerous: their desperation. The prison was a maze of concrete and steel, a world Jason had never prepared for. As he stepped through the gates, he realized that martial arts, as effective as they were in the controlled environment of a ring, would not guarantee his safety here. The rules were different. There were no judges to stop a fight, no time limits, no clear winner. It was all about dominance. Who could control the environment and intimidate others, who had the ability to make others fear them? Officer Grant Walker, a grizzled veteran of the prison system, was one of the few figures in the facility who commanded respect from both the inmates and his fellow guards. He had worked in the toughest prisons for over 2 decades, and his thick neck and powerful shoulders told the story of countless brawls he'd survived. He had the kind of quiet confidence that only comes with years of knowing how to navigate the unpredictable world of incarceration. His greying hair and deep-set eyes revealed the toll the job had taken, but also the sharpness that allowed him to spot trouble before it even started. Walker was used to the arrogance of new inmates, especially the ones like Jason who had been hardened by their past lives in the world outside. But there was something about Jason that intrigued him. Despite his imposing figure and tattoos, there was a level of arrogance in his posture that Walker found almost laughable. It wasn't that Jason didn't belong in this world. It was that he didn't yet understand how to survive in it. He was a fish out of water, still holding on to the illusion that his martial prowess could get him by. But the thing about prison is that the greatest skill you can have is not fighting, it's knowing how to navigate the political landscape. As soon as Jason entered the facility, he found himself targeted by both inmates and guards. The former feared his strength, while the latter saw him as a potential threat to the delicate balance of control in the prison. In prison, strength isn't the only weapon at your disposal. It's manipulation, alliances, and the ability to bend the rules in your favor. Jason's sheer physicality wasn't enough. He learned that the hard way. For weeks he tried to keep to himself, working out and staying out of trouble. But the prison's hierarchy wouldn't let him be left alone for long. One afternoon, Jason found himself in a situation where his pride and quick temper got the better of him. The cafeteria was chaotic, with inmates pushing to get their food before the guards could stop them. Jason, impatient and irritated by the constant noise, tried to step in front of the line to get his tray. Officer Walker, standing guard near the serving window, immediately stepped forward and told him to get back in line. Jason, not used to being challenged in such a way, snapped back with a defiant remark. What happened next was a blur. The tension in the air was palpable as both men squared off. Walker had seen this before, the cocky new inmate who thought his fighting skills would win him the respect he craved. But Jason wasn't thinking about respect. He wasn't thinking about anything other than the challenge. With a cold, calculating motion, he planted his foot and swung. The powerful kick connected with Officer Walker's face with an audible crack, sending him stumbling back against the wall. The room fell silent for a split second, and then chaos erupted. But what Jason hadn't realized was that this wasn't just a fight. It was a declaration of war, and in prison, war doesn't have a referee to step in and call it quits. The impact of Jason's kick reverberated through the cafeteria, silencing the already tense atmosphere. Time seemed to freeze as Officer Walker stumbled backward, his head snapping to one side, blood spurting from his nose, staining his uniform. His hands shot to his face, trying to stop the flow of blood, but it was clear the damage had been done. His eyes widened in disbelief. In all his years of dealing with violent prisoners, no one had ever dared to strike him like this. Most inmates had enough sense to show respect, even if it was out of fear. But Jason, he had just crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Jason stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly with adrenaline. His training had taken over instinctively. The strike had been fluid, precise, and overwhelmingly powerful. But as he watched Walker stagger backward, his stomach twisted with something other than pride. This wasn't a fight in a gym. This wasn't a controlled competition. This was a different kind of violence, one that had no boundaries, no rules, and certainly no immediate way out. The cafeteria erupted into chaos as inmates yelled, guards shouted orders, and footsteps rushed to contain the scene. Jason's heartbeat pounded in his ears, and he suddenly felt like the walls were closing in. For the first time in his life, he realized that everything he thought he knew about power, about being in control, meant nothing here. This wasn't a martial arts competition. It was a prison. And here, he had made a powerful enemy. Within seconds, Jason was swarmed by 2 guards. He didn't fight them off. He didn't have to. They knew better than to try to wrestle with him in the open. Instead, they shoved him hard, forcing him toward the door that led to the holding cells, their hands rough and unforgiving. Jason's mind raced. The kick had been instinctual, a part of his reflexes that had been built up through years of martial arts. But now, facing the consequences of his actions, he felt a creeping sense of dread. He hadn't just struck a guard, he had disrespected the entire system of control within the prison. As Jason was pushed into the holding cell, the realization hit him fully. There would be no quick reprieve for this kind of transgression. It didn't matter that he was a seasoned fighter. Prison wasn't about winning fights one-on-one. It was about surviving the fallout of your actions. The next few hours felt like an eternity. Jason was kept in the holding cell while the incident was reported and the situation escalated. The noise outside the cell was deafening as the prison went on high alert. Jason knew better than to think this would blow over. Walker was a veteran guard. He had friends, allies, and a network of other officers who would back him up. Worse, the other inmates were watching this closely. Word would spread quickly about the man who dared to kick a guard in the face. There was no doubt in Jason's mind that he had just made himself a target, and not just from the guards, but from the other prisoners who would see him as a threat, too. The following days were a blur. He was thrown into solitary confinement for his safety, away from the general population where the consequences of his actions could escalate further. Alone in the cold, sterile confines of the cell, Jason couldn't stop replaying the moment the kick landed. It had felt so right in the moment, a swift act of power that he thought would make him a force to be reckoned with. But now, locked in isolation, he realized that it was his lack of understanding of the true nature of power that had put him here. The guards made regular rounds, but none of them spoke to him. They didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear. Jason was now marked. Walker's retaliation was only a matter of time, and Jason had no doubt that the guards would make sure the blowback would be swift and brutal. But it wasn't just the guards who would be coming for him. The prisoners who had been watching, the ones who saw Jason as a potential kingpin or threat, they too were calculating their next move. They weren't as concerned with the reason for the violence as they were with the power dynamics. In prison, weakness was a scent that everyone could smell. And then came the whispers. Over the next few days, Jason started hearing rumors of what was happening on the other side of the walls. Talk about the new guy who had kicked a guard, talk of alliances being formed between the inmates, and talk of a collective decision to put him in his place. In the prison's ecosystem, it wasn't just about brute force. It was about who controlled the flow of information, who could keep secrets, and who could orchestrate subtle manipulations. It wasn't enough to just be strong. Jason had to figure out how to play the game. His solitary confinement lasted for 3 weeks, and during that time his mind ran through the possibility of the outcome of his actions. He had been a champion, yes, a fighter, no doubt, but in this environment he was nothing more than an outsider who had just made himself visible. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his previous life, his identity as a martial artist, no longer served him here. He was back to square one, but this time it wasn't just about technique. It was about survival, in every sense of the word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jason was called out of solitary confinement and back into the general population. The fear in his gut was visceral as he stepped out into the open. His body instinctively tensed, preparing for a fight, But this wasn't the kind of fight he had trained for. The cafeteria was the same, the inmates still carrying the same tense energy, but the atmosphere was different. Now, there was a target on his back. He found himself walking with a sense of cautious awareness, his every move calculated. He knew it was only a matter of time before Walker would want payback. The guards would be watching him, waiting for any excuse to escalate the situation. But the inmates, they were the wild card. Jason was about to discover that in the jungle of prison, alliances were more dangerous than fists. And right now, every prisoner in the yard had a reason to take him down, either to prove themselves or to make a point. Jason's once unshakable confidence was starting to crack. His physical strength and past skills were no longer enough to navigate this brutal world. Now, it was about understanding the unseen forces, the politics and unspoken rules that governed life behind bars. He had to make a choice: fight with his fists and risk everything, or learn to navigate this complex web of power, betrayal, and survival. The clock was ticking, and Jason knew that the consequences of his kick were just the beginning. The days following Jason's return to the general population felt like he was walking through a minefield. Every step he took, every glance from an inmate or guard, felt like a potential trigger. It wasn't just the physical danger that loomed over him now, it was the psychological warfare that was playing out behind the scenes. Prison, he was learning the hard way, was not a place for the faint-hearted. The constant tension, the game of power and survival, it was a different world altogether. And Jason was no longer the champion of the ring. He was an outsider, a mark, an object of interest, and worse yet, a potential victim. For the first few days, he kept his distance from the other inmates, retreating into himself as he tried to process everything that had happened. The violent act that had started it all, the kick to Officer Walker's face, kept replaying in his mind. He had acted on instinct, driven by a deep-seated arrogance that had been cultivated over years of being the best, but now that arrogance seemed misplaced. Here, in this brutal world, it wasn't about who was the strongest or the most skilled. It was about who could outwit the others, who could play the long game. Jason's reputation as a fighter had no power here. What mattered now was how well he could read people, how he could manipulate the environment, and how quickly he could adapt to a world that was unforgiving to those who didn't understand the rules. The first few encounters with the other inmates were awkward and uncomfortable. Jason knew that everyone was watching him, gauging his every move, testing him to see if he was still the same arrogant fighter he had been in the outside world. He kept his head down, trying to blend in, but that was nearly impossible. His presence alone was enough to draw attention. He had been a champion in the fighting world, and the other prisoners knew that. There was a strange mix of curiosity and wariness in the air as people sized him up, wondering whether he would be a threat or a target. One particular inmate, a large man named Hector, caught Jason's eye. Hector was known in the prison as a dominant figure, a man who had built a reputation for himself through sheer physical strength and intimidation. He had been in and out of prison for years, and his presence commanded respect. Jason had seen him a few times in passing, always surrounded by a small group of loyal followers who respected him and did his bidding. Hector was the type of man who knew how to play the political game in prison, and Jason could tell from the way he carried himself that he wasn't someone to be underestimated. At first, Jason tried to avoid him, but Hector seemed to make it a point to seek him out. One afternoon, Jason was sitting in the common area eating his bland prison meal when Hector approached him. His large frame loomed over Xian, and his eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and calculation. Hector didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down across from Jason, his body language casual, but there was a heavy air of dominance in the way he positioned himself. Jason, still wary, didn't say anything at first either. He knew better than to make any sudden moves or say something that might be seen as disrespectful. In prison, one wrong word could be the difference between a casual conversation and a life-threatening encounter. But Hector wasn't here to threaten him. Not yet, at least. He was sizing him up, testing him. "You're that guy, right?" Hector finally said, his voice low but strong. "The one who kicked the guard in the face." Jason didn't answer immediately. He met Hector's gaze, not showing fear, but the recognition of the game being played. He knew this was not a random question, it was a challenge, an opening for something more. He simply nodded, his jaw tight. Hector leaned in, his massive arm resting on the table between them. "You think you're tough because you can throw a punch, huh? Because you're a champion?" Jason's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. "I don't think I'm tough," he said quietly, meeting Hector's eyes. "I know I am." Hector smiled, a predatory grin that sent a chill down Jason's spine. "You know, the problem with guys like you is you think you're invincible. But here, we don't need to fight like that. We fight with our heads. You've got to learn to play the game if you want to survive." Jason's chest tightened as Hector's words hit him. He had always thought that strength was everything, that it would get him through anything. But Hector was right. Strength was just one piece of the puzzle. Jason's mind raced. Hector wasn't offering friendship. He was offering a choice. Jason could align himself with Hector, get protection, and maybe, just maybe, earn respect. But it came at a price. Hector wasn't the type to offer anything without expecting something in return. Jason kept his thoughts to himself, weighing the situation. He knew he couldn't survive alone, not with the target now on his back. And he couldn't afford to make enemies, especially not the ones who controlled the prison's power dynamics. But aligning himself with Hector meant entering a dangerous world of alliances and manipulations. It meant playing by Hector's rules, living under his shadow. Hector, sensing Jason's hesitation, leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You're smarter than you look," he said, his tone almost approving. "But remember, we all have a role to play here. It's not about being the toughest. It's about being the one who controls everything." Jason felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He wasn't sure if he could trust Hector, but the reality of the prison world was sinking in fast. Survival here wasn't about being the strongest. It was about navigating the social landscape, making the right allies, and playing people's egos and fears against each other. Strength alone wouldn't keep him alive. And if Hector was willing to offer an alliance, then Jason had to consider it, even if it meant compromising some of his principles. For the next few days, Jason observed Hector more closely. He watched the way he interacted with others, how he always had a group of followers, how his every action seemed calculated, deliberate. Hector had mastered the art of manipulation. He had a way of making people feel like they owed him something, like they were lucky to be in his presence. Hector's power came from his ability to control others, to shape the environment around him to his will. He didn't need to fight every battle. He just needed to know when to push, when to pull back, and how to use his influence. Jason was beginning to understand the rules of this new world, and he knew that if he wanted to survive, he had to be smart. But there was still a part of him that clung to the old world, the one where skill and power were enough. He knew, though, that if he was going to make it in this place, he would need to make some hard decisions. He needed to adapt, to learn how to play the game, to balance the fine line between strength and strategy, and to figure out how to make it out of this world alive. And as much as it hurt his pride, Jason knew that if he was going to survive this prison, he had to learn how to manipulate the system just as much as he had learned to dominate in the ring. The question was whether he was willing to sacrifice part of who he was for the sake of survival. The days turned into weeks, and Jason found himself slipping deeper into the prison's unwritten rules of survival. He had spent most of his life believing that strength was his greatest weapon, that his body was his shield. But here, in this place where strength was a commodity and survival was a game of strategy, he was starting to understand that raw power wasn't enough. Hector had taken an interest in him, but not in the way Jason had initially feared. He wasn't just some thug looking to beat down the new guy. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man who controlled the flow of power in the prison. The more Jason watched him, the more he saw the intricate way Hector manipulated those around him. He had people who owed him favors, people who depended on him, people who feared him. He rarely had to lift a finger to get what he wanted because he had already set the pieces in place long before the game even began. Jason knew he had to make a choice. Either he played by Hector's rules or he found a way to carve out his own space in the prison. But carving out his own space meant challenging the existing order. And challenging the order meant making enemies, not just among the inmates, but among the guards as well. After all, the real power in prison wasn't just held by the prisoners. The guards had their own system, their own allegiances, and their own way of controlling the population. Jason learned that the hard way one night. He had been sitting in the yard trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible when a group of inmates approached him. He recognized them immediately. Hector's men. They were low-level enforcers, the kind of guys who did the dirty work in exchange for protection and privileges. Jason tensed, expecting some kind of confrontation, but to his surprise, the leader of the group, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, simply smirked. "Hector wants to talk," he said. Jason's mind raced. He knew better than to ignore an invitation like that. Refusing to speak with someone like Hector wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. The men led him inside, down a dimly lit hallway, until they reached a secluded area near the kitchen. Hector was waiting, leaning against the wall with that same knowing smirk. "Jason," Hector greeted, his voice smooth, calculated. "You've been keeping to yourself." Jason crossed his arms, keeping his expression neutral. "Just trying to figure things out." Hector chuckled. "That's good. But see, here's the thing. You can't just sit on the sidelines forever. Eventually, you've got to choose where you stand." Jason already knew where this was going. Hector wasn't asking for loyalty. He was demanding it. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jason said cautiously. Hector's smirk widened. "Trouble finds everyone in here. It's just a matter of whether you face it alone or with the right people." Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the crossroads. If he accepted Hector's offer, he would be under his thumb, expected to carry out whatever tasks were given to him. If he refused, he'd be marked as an outsider, someone without protection, and in a place like this, being alone was a death sentence. Jason exhaled slowly. "What do you want from me?" Hector's expression shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're a fighter, and a good one from what I've heard. I could use someone like you." Jason felt a sinking feeling in his gut. "Use me for what?" Hector's smirk didn't fade. "Call it enforcement. Every now and then there are people who need reminders. A little push to make sure they know their place. You're good at that, aren't you?" Jason clenched his fists. He knew exactly what Hector was asking. He wanted Jason to become his weapon, someone to intimidate, to hurt, to enforce his will on others. And Jason hated it. He had spent his life training to fight with honor, to test himself against opponents in the ring. This was something different. This was about breaking people, not competing with them. Jason hesitated, and Hector noticed. "Don't overthink it," Hector said. "This isn't about being a bad guy. This is about survival. You help me, I help you. It's that simple." Jason's mind was at war with itself. He had always believed in the strength of his own fists, but he had never wanted to become a weapon for someone else's power games. And yet, what choice did he really have? Before he could answer, the sound of boots echoing down the hallway broke the tension. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, Officer Walker. Jason's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen Walker much since the incident, but the guard's presence alone sent a wave of unease through him. Walker's gaze locked onto Jason, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smirk. "You. Come with me." Jason didn't move at first. He glanced at Hector, whose expression had turned unreadable. Walker took a step forward when Did I stutter? Jason knew he couldn't refuse. With a final glance at Hector, he followed the guard down the hallway, his pulse pounding. The walk was silent, but Jason could feel the tension radiating off Walker. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. Not the usual authority of a guard, but something darker. Something personal. Walker led him into a small, isolated room. No windows, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a single overhead light that cast harsh shadows across the walls. "Sit," Walker ordered. Jason hesitated, then complied. The guard took his time pacing the room, his hands resting on his belt. Then he leaned against the wall and folded his arms. "You think you're smart, huh?" Jason said nothing. Walker scoffed. "You think that kick made you a legend in here? You think it made you untouchable?" Jason clenched his jaw. "I'm not looking for trouble." Walker laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Trouble's already looking for you." Jason kept his posture relaxed, but his body was coiled, ready for whatever was coming. Walker took a step closer. "Here's how this works, tough guy. You don't run this place. Hector doesn't run this place. I do." His voice dropped lower. "And if you think for a second that I've forgotten what you did, you're dead wrong." Jason felt his muscles tense, but he stayed silent. Walker leaned in, his breath hot against Jason's face. "I own you now. You step out of line and I will make sure you don't get back up. Understand?" Jason's fists tightened beneath the table. He had spent his whole life fighting against men like this, bullies who thought they were untouchable. But here, in this place, Walker really did have all the power. Jason took a slow breath. He wasn't going to win this fight with his fists, not yet. He had to play the game just like Hector said. Finally, he nodded. Walker smirked. "Smart choice." He straightened, adjusting his belt. "You're going to learn something real fast in here. The strongest man in the room isn't the one who can throw the hardest punch. It's the one who knows exactly when to throw it." With that, Walker turned and walked out, leaving Jason alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of those words settling over him. He had spent his whole life believing that fighting would solve everything, but now he understood the truth. Fists could only take him so far. To survive this place, he had to learn how to fight without ever throwing a punch.